Ms. Applebaum, I'm delighted you agreed to this interview. Thank you so very much. This is a podcast for literal publishing, and it is hosted in Cultura 21, a cultural space that accommodated us today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You write and speak about real estate developers negotiating peace in a way that actually prolongs conflict, about a boiling Europe that the United States maybe don't grasp in its full turmoil and transformation, but also about the way in which Stalin historically weaponized famine. Now, all of these things are actually intertwined, and they reshape the geopolitical perspective on Eastern Europe. Do you ever feel the weight of your work?
Do I feel the weight of my work?
Yes.
I mean, I don't really think about myself when I work. My work is about other people. So I'm just trying to translate and explain the world. And I try not to let it affect me very much.
You are visiting Romania now after the Munich Security Conference, and it is just shortly after we have marked 4 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. Which are your thoughts now, during this visit maybe, about this part of the world?
So Romania is a really important part of what NATO calls the Eastern flank, but which is really, it's really a line that goes up through along Eastern Europe and through the Baltic Sea. These are the countries that are most affected by the war in Ukraine, have the most to lose if it goes badly, who I think have the best understanding of Ukraine and of Ukrainians. Romania, Poland, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, Germany actually now, and the UK. These are the countries who I think have best understood the stakes and significance of this war. And I think it's really important that Romania remain a integrated part of this coalition of the willing, and also obviously of the European Union and of NATO. I know that there are voices in Romania who are anti-Ukrainian and maybe sometimes even pro-Russian. And I hope that the rest of the society begins to see and understand, why those voices are so loud and unites against them. Romania plays a role both that it's not just military, it's also, I think, kind of political because of where you sit. You have a border with Moldova. You're obviously very closely related to Moldova. You have a historic, long relationship with Ukraine. You're on the Black Sea. You're at the economic heart of this region as well. And I hope Romanians recognize how important their country is now and what a huge role it has to play.
It is also a note of this tension. I mean, it's the vicinity, of course, of the conflict and everything, but also the waves of tension that somehow come here. And I was wondering, what are you most concerned about regarding Eastern Europe at this point?
I think I'm most concerned about Russian and other information campaigns that are aimed at, of course there are weaknesses in Romania, there are weaknesses in all countries, that are aimed at the weaknesses and political divisions and are designed to create turmoil in Romania and also to turn Romanians against Ukrainians. So we see both, we see Russian information campaigns, we see Russian sabotage campaigns, we see Russian cyber campaigns, cyber attacks. Actually, just this week, a Polish hospital was attacked.
Exactly.
By probably Russian actors. In Poland, we also had a explosion along a railway line. But I'm telling you things there are Germany, Spain, UK, really almost everywhere in Europe. We've felt the impact of both physical and psychological campaigning. And I'm worried about that. And of course, there's a part of the American political spectrum which now aligns also with these Russian campaigns, maybe for different reasons. But and so it's become a pretty confusing world out there. And I'm worried about whether the majority of the population here and elsewhere is able to recognize and understand this, physical and emotional sabotage for what it is.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out. In Autocracy, you examined regimes from China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Iran, and so on. And I think we're all just looking in awe at violence, at historical violence unfolding before our eyes in Iran right now. And I was wondering, what is the general public supposed to actually really look at in order to fully attempt to understand the events and their echoes throughout the world in all of their complexity?
Oh, I don't recommend that the general public or anybody else try to understand everything all at once.
At least
really,
a broader picture. Yeah.
No, really, if you want to, it's try to understand one piece of the world, and that will help you understand the rest. I mean, I wouldn't try to understand everything, but I mean, we really are living in an era of pretty profound change. Economic change, political change, social change, demographic change. It's a moment when we have in the United States a president who doesn't see the world in terms of grand strategy, but sees almost all events in terms of his own, how they benefit him and people around him. So this is a very different kind of United States. That makes him very unpredictable, and that suddenly makes world politics everywhere very unpredictable because America is so important. At the same time, we have, we still have the autocratic alliance that I wrote about, although it's a bit smaller than it was 2 years ago, also remains. I mean, so Russia and China remain allied, and they remain allied in their dislike of liberal democracy and the language of liberal democracy, and in their willingness to try to undermine it, both in their own countries and the language in their own countries as well as everywhere else. As we're speaking, on this date, what is today?
Tuesday.
Today's Tuesday. Yeah. Today's Tuesday. I mean, everything might be different by tomorrow, but right now there's still an Iranian regime which is allied with them as well. If that were to change, that would obviously change the complexion of things in the Middle East, but we don't know what will happen yet. But so we're still living in a world where there's a competition of ideas, and there are a set of autocratic ideas, a belief in a single unified state with run by a single person or party, which controls the media, which controls the judges, which doesn't tolerate rule of law, but instead believes in rule by law, meaning the law is what the person in charge says it is. And this way of thinking still clashes with a liberal democratic way of thinking, which is a belief in checks and balances, that rulers owe something to their people, that people have the right to choose their rulers. And you don't see this clash at work in every conflict, but you see it in many. It's underlying many of the things that you see. I mean, listen always for, if you're trying to understand, the role that people are playing, listen to the way the leaders talk. Do they speak about themselves representing a sovereign nation that has chosen them and to which they owe some loyalty and from which they obtain their legitimacy, or are they speaking for themselves? I mean, I think that's the difference between different leaders.
You spoke about change, and in preparation for this interview, I was reading how you drove from Warsaw to Berlin to cover the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I was wondering whether the change that we're living through right now is similar in significance to that moment.
I think it is, actually. I think we're at a similar moment of global change,
yes.
And one of the things that characterizes moments of global change is that we don't know how it will end. So. I can't, and actually at the time I went to Berlin, we didn't know how that would end either. A lot of things seem very obvious in retrospect when you look back at, and of course it would end well and Germany would reunify and so on, but actually at that moment we didn't know. And right now we're at a similar kind of moment. We don't know what direction the world would be. I would say there's one important thing that's happened that changes inside the United States, but also elsewhere, which is that in recent years, there's been a rediscovery of old ideas. Ideas from the 1920s, from the 1930s. Ideas about a certain definition of sovereignty, a certain use of violence and cruelty as being legitimate, a way of doing politics that's very divisive. You have friends and enemies.
Everything's very radical.
There's a German philosopher called Carl Schmitt who became very fashionable again in America on the far right and actually in some cases on the far left. and I know he's being read elsewhere as well. And this is also the rediscovery of the idea of politics as emergency, that rulers can, the really strong rulers can take power at a given moment by declaring an emergency, by creating emergency and overruling the law. And I think in the next few years, we're going to see a lot of conflict between that way of thinking and a thinking based in legal institutions and continuity. I mean, it's a different way of saying what I just said before, is that we're watching a conflict of ideas play itself out in different ways in different places.
What is the most important shift in the way autocracy is shaping financial and economic power throughout the world now?
The main characteristic of autocracy is secrecy. In an autocracy, we don't know really what happens to money or where it goes. So, for example, Putin is very rich. He has palaces, where he has his own hockey rink and hookah bar and all kinds of things. And we've seen pictures of the palace, and we've seen films of it thanks to Aleksei Navalnîi, who filmed this or got the plans and put it on TV. And we hear stories of him owning apartments and things in Europe and elsewhere. But we don't really have any idea where his money comes from, what bank account it's in. We don't know the relationship between the Russian state and Putin's private money. And the same is true of Xi Jinping. We think he's very rich. He has a very wealthy family. There were Western reporters who tried to write about his family. But again, it's a mystery. We don't know the relationship between those rulers, their money, and the state. And actually, in the Western world, over the last couple of decades, we've created a whole system of institutions that are designed to help people like that hide their money. Tax havens, shell companies, anonymous ways of doing anonymous transactions. I mean, this whole system has been used by people in the autocratic world to steal and hide money and keep it in different places around the world. And unfortunately, that pattern of secrecy now begins to affect Western countries as well. I mean, of course, it was always there, but it's growing. So this kind of secret world that exists alongside the real world, the power of that is growing, and I think that is it's fundamentally undemocratic and fundamentally autocratic to have a system of, as I said, secret bank accounts hidden in Caribbean islands or even in Luxembourg or less so Switzerland. I know Swiss have made an effort to push back against it, but in the United States as well.
Aleksei Navalnîi's memoir, A Patriot, was also published by Litra Publishing, your publisher in Romania as well. Now news of the circumstances of his death in February last year is being updated, and Germany, the UK, France, I think, are supporting the scenario that people suspected that he was poisoned, and the actual toxin found in dart frogs was identified. Now, do you think this confirmation of an existing scenario, as I was saying, will influence future attempts of resisting authoritarianism in any way? I mean, they're designed, the death of Navalny was happened for a reason. It was designed to discourage other people in Russia from speaking out. And it's interesting to think about why Navalny was perceived as so dangerous. What did he do? And the answer is that he focused on this issue of corruption and this issue of secrecy, and he revealed in the videos that he made, and then in his writing and blogging and so on, he revealed the existence of this secret system of wealth, this secret economy that has existed alongside the real economy, and that was for the Russian authorities really dangerous because it exposed the basis of their power, and that was why they felt they had to kill him, because he was too. It was appealing and it was popular what he did, because even in Russia, even in China, even in Iran, maybe even especially in Iran, almost everywhere where there are really consolidated authoritarian states, you have people who
begin to dream of something else. Because if you live in a state where there's no justice, where the economy is unfair, where there's really no freedom of speech, then it's almost like the ideas of liberal democracy. You don't even need to be taught them. You don't have to read about, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson, or you don't have to know anything about the EU or any of the Venice Commission. I mean, you don't have to know anything. You understand intuitively, because you live in a world without rights and without the rule of law. You begin to understand why those things are good. And so any dictatorship knows that these ideas will always reemerge, even if you cut off your country completely, because they're instinctive to human beings. People understand that unfair systems are unfair, and they understand that that illegitimate leaders need at some point to ask for people to make their regimes legitimate. And somebody like Navalny, who's especially good at stoking and inspiring that feeling, is very dangerous to them. The language of liberal democracy is very dangerous to dictators.
I know that Autocracy was recently published by One Publishing, Iuliei Navalnîia's publishing house, and I was wondering how you received that news.
No, I mean, of course, I agreed to it. No, I was really happy that they wanted to publish my book. It's really important that Russians also read, what is said about them and how they're perceived abroad. Just as it's important for Americans to do that too. It's not specific to Russians, but I think she still has a lot of authority as somebody who actually never tried to play a political role before, and I'm glad she's decided to use it to publish books.
I'm very thankful we have Autocracy, Red Fame, and The Twilight of Democracy. There's the Iron Curtain behind you there, published in Romanian. Which part of your work do you find most pressing nowadays?
Oh, most pressing? I mean, I thought you were going to ask me what I like the most. There's a different question. No, I mean, there is especially in the last year, there's an enormous amount of news. And I right now feel this obligation to try to describe to people what's happening, because some of it is complicated, and especially inside the United States, there have been a lot of changes inside the way the administration works, inside the American government, and not all of it is obvious. And so I try to explain it to people. That's what I do now. I mean, I will eventually write another book again, but I hope at some point to go back to writing history books. But I feel this obligation now to do journalism.
Since you mentioned it, I won't ask you which you like the best, but I will ask you which consumed you the most.
Oh, well, so the book I wrote on the history of the Gulag, so this was a book that took 10 years, which is a long time. And I wrote it starting in my late 20s, and I wrote it in the 1990s at a moment when there was still the possibility of working inside Russian archives, and I traveled all over Russia.
This is the Pulitzer.
This is what it did win the Pulitzer eventually, but I didn't know that while I was writing it. And I went to Siberia, I went to Vorkuta, I went to the Soviet Islands in the sort of Russian far north, and worked in, about a dozen different archives all over the country, and also interviewed dozens of people. And that was probably the biggest effort in terms of, time. And I mean, it's very funny. I mean, even while I was writing it, I have friends who said to me afterwards that at a certain point they didn't really believe I was writing a book. I said I was writing a book, but because it took so long and I didn't finish it. I had actually 2 children while I was writing it, so. But it was probably the most absorbing, longest project. The book I like the most is actually that one, The Iron Curtain.
The Iron Curtain.
Because it's about this strange period after the Second World War, when the Red Army was here, and it was in the region, and people were trying to emerge from the horror of the war and recreate something. And it's really a book about how people, well, not just democracy, but democracy and the rule of law and civil society are crushed at that moment. But then, of course, they later on reemerge.
Well, thank you so much for having shared that with us. I'm personally in the reading aftermath of the Red Famine and very much under the impact of this book.
And that was, so I'll just say one thing about that book. So that book was, it was, you know, I wrote it, I had help writing it. I had the Harvard Ukrainian Institute gave me a lot of advice. And so in some ways it was easier than the Gulag, which really was, I was writing it with no, you know, from scratch. That book was the one that I found the hardest to physically write, because it's a book that describes, part of it describes what it's like to starve to death.
Exactly.
And it was very hard to write, and it was very hard to kind of live through the research. So that was maybe, in that sense, it was the most difficult book. It's
definitely completely absorbing for a reader, and you ask yourself and you ask the reading audience, what actually happened between 1917 and 1934 actually that influenced the future. And my question to you, based on your observations and on your research, would be, how does a cultural genocide actually happen?
So, I mean, in in Ukraine, you have the emergence at the same time as the Russian Revolution. You had the emergence for the first time of a Ukrainian state. So there's also a Ukrainian national revolutionary moment also in 1918, and you have the beginnings of the fight to create an independent Ukraine. And there were sort of a couple of different Ukrainian formations, and they fought both the Bolsheviks and they also fought the white armies, the Tsarist armies. And they lost, and Ukraine wound up as part of the Soviet Union. But the battles that the Bolsheviks fought against them were not forgotten, especially by Stalin. And he remained anxious and concerned about the possibility of a revolutionary Ukraine, an anti-Bolshevik Ukraine. And he spoke about it and he thought about it, and there's a period in the 1920s when there was a lot more freedom for the Ukrainian national movement, and Ukrainian language was allowed to flourish, and theater and books and so on. And then Stalin brought that to an end right about the same time. He also collectivized agriculture, so he forced all the peasants onto state farms, and he was very afraid of what an independent Ukraine or a Ukrainian national movement would mean for Moscow. You know, that they could challenge Russia, they could challenge the Bolsheviks, they could challenge his regime. And I think the idea of, you know, eliminating or exterminating Ukraine as an idea really begins then, because Ukraine is a problem for Stalin. Like, it's a, you know, you can't really absorb it. It's not, you can't make it Russian, you know, it's not really Russian. It isn't Russian at all, in fact. And he was constantly afraid that there would be a, you know, eruption of dissent in Ukraine that would threaten him. And so I think it's the desire to get rid of a political problem. And as you know, the famine has different aspects. So some of it was removing food from peasants. So it wasn't just the weather, you know. Exactly. It was a deliberately created famine in which they removed food from people's homes. And at the same time, it was followed almost immediately by this, as you say, cultural genocide. So intellectuals, writers, museum curators, priests, anybody who was seen as a kind of carrier of Ukrainian culture was arrested. Many were killed, many were sent to the Gulag. And this was, you know, this kind of pressure on Ukraine as a, you know, as a state, as a state of mind, as an idea, continued all the way through until the end of the Soviet Union. But I think the origin of it is in this idea that Ukrainian nation is somehow a threat to Moscow. And I think that continues today. So Putin's modern objection to Ukraine, some of it is his imperial nostalgia. You know, he remembers an era when, he personally remembers the era of the Soviet Empire, and he probably imagines that he also, you know, lays claim to older Russian Empire. But he also fears this language, this is again what we were talking about before, this language of democracy and this language of freedom that the Ukrainians use. And they've returned to, you know, at the time of the Orange Revolution in 2004 and 5, at the time of the Maidan in 2014.
Exactly.
And of course, you can hear it now. The Ukrainians keep using this language of sovereignty, democracy, self-determination, rule of law. They use this language, and this language is very dangerous to Putin because it's exactly the opposite of his kind of power. And you can see, Russia and Ukraine are sufficiently close. There are lots of intermarriage, joint history. An independent, sovereign, self-determined, democratic Ukraine that was integrated with Europe. He sees this as a threat to his power. Just like Stalin saw independent Ukraine as a threat to his power. Because if the Ukrainians can have democracy, then why can't Russians? And sooner or later, somebody will say that.
Yes, it will become infectious in a way. But it's very interesting that you speak about this dynamics of discourse of power, discourse of sovereignty, but they're all mirrored by different types of silences. And I was thinking the other day, preparing for this meeting with you, I was interviewing an expert in bullying. And at some point she said, I also blame the innocent bystander. So it's also, and you write about this extensively, about the fact that the rest of the world somehow reported in accordance with this misinformation, actually, with this piece of propaganda that was being sold to the world.
So the Ukrainian famine, there were some people who believed propaganda, but there were also people who ignored the famine because other things were more important. Because famine is in 1933, this is when Hitler comes to power.
Yes.
And so many of the Western powers, thought this is not a good moment to antagonize Stalin. But even the Vatican was relatively silent. A lot of groups and people who could have said something were silent because they needed to have a relationship with Russia, or there was something they wanted. And so you see easily how a great tragedy was ignored, even when people could see it. In Poland, they saw people coming over the border who were starving, and there was a network of priests inside Ukraine who saw things happening. There were diplomats. There was actually an Italian diplomat who wrote very eloquently about the famine as he saw it unfolding from his base inside Ukraine. So there were people who saw it, but they all had reasons to ignore it. Or as I say, some of them had reasons why they accepted the propaganda. There's a famous incident he's a journalist for the New York Times. He was actually British, but he was an American journalist who certainly knew about the famine, but it just wasn't in his interest to write about it for a lot of reasons, because it didn't fit his narrative about the Soviet Union, because he wanted to stay there. He needed a permission to live there. So there were a lot of reasons. There are always reasons that people had to excuse tragedies.
What is the most valuable thing you feel you have learned in this long and ongoing process of examining authoritarianism?
I think it's that both the human impulse towards dictatorship, this desire to have all problems solved and have just one unified power, this never disappears. You have it in all democracies. There's some group of people who don't like liberal democracy or are uncomfortable in it, would rather just have one person in charge. But also, at the same time, that this desire for not just democracy, but justice, fairness, this also never disappears. So there, you see them in constant conflict.
On the one hand, it is remarkable how much journalism can uncover now in the 21st century, but on the other hand, there is censorship, misinformation as a political weapon, fake news, and so on. How do we protect journalism in an era where fact-based communication is almost crucial to survival?
It's one of the hardest problems right now, and there's no obvious solution. Journalists and people who want to transmit factual information need new business models. The old ways of doing journalism don't work anymore. You can't make money from them. You can't. Journalism costs something. It takes time to go and find something out and put together information. And so the ones who survive will be the ones who find some new way to pay for it. I mean, whether it's through subscriptions, whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through local businesses coming together to support local news, and this is happening in the United States in a few places. There needs to be different models and different ways of thinking about it. I think that's the main lesson. I mean, there is going to come a point when it'll become a bigger societal problem, because with the growth of AI, we see more and more people asking AI chatbots for information. But the chatbots are only as good as the information available on the internet. And someone has to get the information from the real world to the internet. In other words,
it's mediated, yes.
AI hasn't eliminated the need for journalism or for history or for fact-finding. And so there's some, at some point it'll become clear that there's a social and political and probably even business need for real information. And then maybe we'll start to think seriously about where it's going to come from.
You also did a lot in the area of education on this topic. I was reading about Agora, the program you created for the London School of Economics, which then moved to Johns Hopkins. And it's, I think, in this step of informing people and maybe addressing
this is a project that I did where we did different kinds of experiments. And so a lot of it was working with newspapers to look at, are there better ways to tell stories? How do you get people to read factual information? We examined the way also propaganda campaigns worked in some elections. We looked at German elections. We looked at Swedish elections. I mean, this is now going back a few years. Ultimately, you need to fight this kind of stuff. You need a really broad community of people interested. You need government. You need journalists. You need teachers. You need schools. You need civil society. I mean, you need a broad range of people. And I think we're still at the stage of raising the awareness of why it matters.
Autocracy is dedicated to optimists. What gives you hope?
I feel really hopeful when I talk to younger people. I feel like, I don't know how old you are, but, I'm somebody, I didn't grow up with the internet, and I, learned about it and learned how to use it and so on. I see younger people who are much more savvy than we were. I mean, they understand how manipulation works, online, and they're much better at and much faster at thinking about how we're going to get better ideas to move more quickly, and how all these things, journalism, politics, maybe democracy itself, require some really radical rethinking. And I think it's like people in their 20s and 30s who are going to do it, because they're more attuned to the way that world works, and they give me a lot of optimism.
My final question to you is, what do you think we should speak about more in a louder voice?
What should we speak about more? We should speak about the horror being inflicted on the Ukrainians. What it means to not have electricity and heat in a modern city, for many days in the winter. We should speak about the pain and suffering of war, whether it's in Iran or Gaza. I think we because all these things are distant, we tend to kind of dehumanize them and generalize, and we're seeing how it is that people are experiencing history. We should focus more on that.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Sunt Ioana Bâldea Constantinescu, mulțumesc că ați fost împreună cu noi și vă invit să ne fiți alături și pentru episodul următor, pentru că, nu-i așa, poveștile bune nu se termină niciodată.